Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Open to Export webinar about the opportunities and challenges of exporting to Africa. My name is William Barnes-Graham, and I am the Senior Content Editor at the Institute of Exports and International Trade. Open to Export is a free online service helping small businesses get ready to sell overseas through our step-by-step articles and guides, regular webinars, our Export Action Plan tool, and our quarterly competitions. You can find out about all of these on our website at www.opentoexport.com. Open to Export is powered by the Institute of Export and International Trade, the UK's professional membership body for traders. Endorsed by the World Trade Organization and the International Chamber of Commerce as a small business champion, we offer a unique range of individual and business membership benefits, education and training catering for beginners through to master's degrees, and an always exciting and prestigious programme of events celebrating UK businesses' exporting achievements. We will be running a live Q&A later in the session, and you can ask questions at any point using the question box on the control panel to the right-hand side of your screen. The general principle here is that we'll ask questions that are relevant to the broader audience, so we won't be able to go into company specifics as such, but if you do have any specific questions, we can refer you to our technical helpline afterwards. Obviously, Africa is a huge continent full of myriad markets which each have their own culture and each require a specific market entry plan. However, we have 4 great speakers today, and between them we will hopefully be able to show you where you can get further support, and we'll also look at the UK's top markets on the continent in a little more detail too. Richard Zurba from Zurcom International will highlight the diversity of African markets before looking at South Africa in a little more detail. Ian Gray from the Egypt-Britain Business Council will look at the Egyptian market. And from OREAD Group, Manny Ajuwon will look at the West Africa region, including Nigeria and Ghana. But to kick things off, giving an overview of government support across Africa, we have Natalia Debzcak-Debski from the Department for International Trade. Over to you, Natalia. Anyway, so our next presenter is going to say a little bit more about Africa as a continent in general, and also finish on South Africa as our first sort of focus market. So over to you, Richard.
Thank you, William, and everybody, just a gracious welcome from South Africa. So thank you for the introduction. Maybe we can go to the first slide, please. My company is based out of South Africa. Now, I'm also the chairman of a group called IBG Global, and we've got offices all over the world with similar small companies like mine. Many of them work with British companies. We have worked with British companies across Africa, and over the 20 years of existence, my company here in South Africa, based in South Africa, with staff in 9 other countries, has worked with over 4,000 different companies entering the African market. Next, please. Great. I just want to look at everybody, just watch this animation because it really does project where Africa is going. So right now, we've seen the African continent as not being of too great of importance as the world economy goes. But if you look at the absolute population relative to the rest of the world, you can see that this animation from the University of Sheffield really tells us where Africa is going. And this is going to be of critical importance to understanding the African market in the future. And I've noted the number of companies that are in the group listening, and I'm thinking that really almost every company that does export should be interested in the African market, and particularly from Britain, which is a traditional trading partner with Africa. this is going to be a critically important avenue of approach strategically for British small and medium-sized companies. So for everybody that's on the discussion, I'm really glad that you're listening. As Natalia indicated, by within a few years, Africa is going to have its per capita income doubled, and by the end of, or by about 3/4 of the way through this century, it is going to be the source of over half of the world's new labor force. And so as we look at the growth in the middle class and the growth in the demographics, the growth in GDP per capita, everything is pointing to Africa as a key location for doing business into the future. Next, please. Just to give you a quick snapshot on the relative size of the economies and the relative size of the population. So the first thing is that we see that South Africa doesn't have a huge market in terms of population, but GDP-wise, it is relatively important. And we see that places like East Africa, which do have a relatively large population, but apparently a smaller GDP, are growing very quickly. And so that purple side of the continent is going to be doubling every decade at the current growth phase. And so that we'll be looking at countries such as Kenya, maybe Tanzania, in about 20 years, equaling the size of South Africa, if South Africa and everything else remain equal. So this is just an interesting perspective on just understanding the size of the GDP versus the size of the population. And it can also help you conceptualize what's going on in the market. Next, please. A few more things. If you look at the geographical size of the continental USA, in Africa, you can easily put over 4 Americas into Africa. If you look at the center map, this is where it shows where English is spoken. And if you are still getting a bit of history in your schooling, then you'll understand that these countries have a very close affinity with Britain as being part of the Commonwealth of Nations. And in fact, even if you look at Mozambique and Cameroon, which are not red on the map, they do belong to the Commonwealth of Nations. They joined in the 1990s. So it is, and by the way, Rwanda did try to join a few years ago, but was, I'm not sure if they were allowed to join. And so the Commonwealth is seen as an interesting group of countries that countries even now want to join. Emerging countries that were not even part of the British Empire are interested to join the Commonwealth for some of the benefits. Now, if you look at the map on the right, and you'll notice that the population density matches a lot of where the red English language is spoken. And so most of business in Africa, about 60%, can be conducted in English, whether that's a first or a second language for the person that you'll be speaking to. And this gives you a competitive advantage over even a lot of your European competition, or competition especially from places like China, where English is at a deficit. And so, in fact, again, this is part of Britain's strategic center. Next, please. Again, importantly, you can see where Christianity is of key importance in sub-Saharan Africa. And in the north, it's Islam. And this is the map illustrates how things are divided. The blue in the center and the red in the center on the driving map, you're safe and secure and driving on the same side as you are here. I just threw that in for interest. And for my own staff and some subcontractors, particularly in Morocco and West Africa, you can see where our staff are located across Africa. Next, please. Of key importance is the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which is actually just being kicked off. But the first thing is that Africa has always had some very good, strong customs unions, particularly starting with 1910 with the Southern Africa Customs Union. And that has being a very strong part of, first of all, the different trading zones in the British Empire, and then moving into the history of the present. And we've looked at other areas of growth, and then we have had strong groups such as the East African Community, COMESA, ECOWAS, and not only have these countries worked in tandem very closely, but in general they've been relatively successful in negotiating and then working things through. So Africa does not have a history which is full of discord in terms of creating these kinds of groupings. And so going to the Africa Continental Free Trade Area is a bit of a natural for what will be happening. So if we go to the next slide, please. So in May of this year, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area was finally kicked off, and so it is in law right now, and the different protocols are being looked at. 22 countries have ratified it through their parliaments, and we're looking possibly for another 20 within the next year or so. So most of the countries that have signed, which is 52 countries, almost all of Africa, are well on the way to joining this grouping. Now, what is important about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area for British companies? Well, the first thing is it's going to create a common market in cross-border trade across Africa, and there's going to be common tariffs entering Africa. So this is going to be one thing to understand. It's going to make it less of a system of 54 countries. It's going to provide some continuity in terms of your ability to understand it as a destinational market. The next thing is that structural trade issues will be looked at, and that includes trade corridors, border crossings, and all of that kind of thing. Not least, we'll be looking at standardized marks, such as the CE mark in Europe. We'll be looking at a similarity for South Africa, joining in with a lot of other entities which have relatively poor standardization. So within South Africa, we've got the South African Bureau of Standards, for example, and that mark is very key and important here. And having a tie-in with a commonality will make it a lot easier for some of the smaller economies to join in, and that will make it easier for British companies to finally join in to entering the African market. The next thing is trademarks and copyrights will likely be addressed, and then perhaps a common currency. Now, a lot of this will take up to 20 years, but the progress in this will be very important. And I think that for British companies coming into Africa, the key thing is that this will help you in your competitive advantage against some of the other countries where the principles of doing good business are not so well addressed. And I'm not going to name those countries out here right now, but I'm going to tell you that companies that look for legal compliance and an equal playing field for everybody are going to win in this market, simply because a lot of the legal structure for doing business in Africa is going to be addressed, and there are likely going to be common structures to address items like corruption coming into the market. And then it will make it an easier market to enter, simply because effectively understanding how to get into it from a common perspective will assist you, similar to understanding how things work in Europe. Once you've addressed the main structure, then you can address some of the other structures. So that's really some of the things about Africa and the Continental Free Trade Area. Thanks. Next. Okay, where is Africa growing? If you look at the demographic curve on the, or triangle on the top, the present population of Africa, or just slightly out of date, it looks like a very big triangle. Now, if you look at East Asia in about the year 1978, 1980, it looks like the same part of that top of the population graph there. So effectively, demographically, Africa is where China and Southeast Asia were at about the time they started taking off. When Deng Xiaoping changed the Chinese rules toward bringing a new era of business development into China. This is where Africa is demographically. Now, if you look at the chart at the left bottom, you'll see that the African population relative to other populations of labor force age people is growing immensely, while almost every other market is diminishing already. So Africa is going to be the place where people are going to be seeking business, seeking to do jobs, and this population growth could be a problem if it wasn't being addressed by a growth in GDP. And we're seeing that the growth in GDP is being addressed, as Natalia indicated at the very beginning. So if you look at these two curves together, the two graphs on the bottom, they enforce each other exponentially. Next. So if you look at a graph of the growth in the total size of the economy of Africa, we see that there's an inflection point slightly after the year 2000. Now, I've got a theory about this, and I'm going to tell you a bit about what really happened and what brought Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, up to a growth where the GDP is now about 2.2, 2.3 trillion US dollars. Next. The first thing is that when you do business, your values matter, and how you go about finding business and how you go about making those transactions happen, it has a lot to do with what's inside you. So culture can be something that is, how you shake hands, how you hand over a business card, how you say hello, but your values are what hold that culture up. And so this is a German study that's done every 5 years. They take about 65,000 people and ask them a barrage of questions, and they try to figure out where people are in the world relative to their values. And you'll see that Great Britain is right in the center of the English-speaking world a bit. And so if you look at the different axes, the bottom one is traditional society. The top one is secular in sociological terms, which is the opposite of traditional. And then on the right, you have people who are primarily ideological, and on the left, you have people that are survivalist, which is the opposite of ideological. Now, in the English-speaking world, and I'm Canadian, so I've got a pretty close affinity to people in Britain there in terms of my ideological leanings. We're sort of between the traditional and the secular. We kind of look at each and we balance, and we see these things. If you're up in Protestant Europe, you'll typically not have such a strong tie to traditionalism, but you'll want to be doing things from an ideological perspective. Now, if you're down in the Latin American quadrant, which is very traditional and very ideological, it's no wonder that ideas like liberation theology come out of that area, because people are very communally oriented and yet very traditional. Now, if you look at the very top left, that's where the oligarchies are. And so countries that deal with a center where power and money are meaning the same things, they come from that area. So it doesn't mean that Vladimir Putin isn't going to be unpopular. It means that he could be popular because most of the people would buy into that kind of an idea. And so, and then you go down into the quadrant where the African and Middle Eastern countries are, and what we see is that African countries are typically very traditional and very survivalist. But what is happening is that there's a big movement. The English-speaking countries first are moving away from that quadrant and toward the English-speaking market, meaning that they are becoming, in terms of how they do business and how they view corruption and how they view political stability and how they view property rights and almost every other thing that goes along with a successful business democracy, business-oriented democracy or entrepreneurial community values, we're coming together, and that makes it a lot easier because we don't have to go and transfer our own values across the map very quickly. South Africa used to be in way further down in the quadrant, and they've moved to the center of the map over the last 15 or 20 years. And so this is really an interesting thing. And I think if you're a business, then quickly go and check this out online. Next, please. So young people, and a number of studies have shown this, that the African middle class has changed very quickly relative to the previous generation. So they're more focused on what they can accomplish by themselves, individual goals. It used to be that African cultures were much more collectivized. This is changing, and young people are becoming very focused on their own goals. Number two, they'll seek a comfortable middle-class lifestyle. Three, they're still very vulnerable to dire disease and financial problems. The next thing is they're still very family-oriented, and they consider their faith communities extraordinarily important. And one thing that's very interesting is that studies have shown that young people in Africa are going to church at double the rate that their grandparents were going. And so approximately 70% of young people in Africa are adherents to a church community, which is very interesting relative to Europe right now. The next thing is they focus, and they're very strong in terms of forward thinking. They're forward thinking planners, and they work very hard. Number six, entrepreneurial culture across Africa among the young middle class is a key characteristic. And so they're looking for business startups. They're looking for things that are both informal and formal. And this is one driving thing about Africa, that they're tying all of this together. And through this, there's an abhorrence of corruption. And the young people are making big changes. Now consider that the youth, if you go back to all of those other things, the average young person in Africa is 19.5 years old. And so they actually, if you look at people 32 and under, they control the voting bloc of any one country. So if you're not youth oriented, you're going to be losing your elections. And this is another thing, that young people who do not want corruption are changing what's going on in Africa right now, democratically or internally inside countries where we've seen, such as South Africa, we've seen an internal change. And so there's a lot of change that's going on, and this is good for Britain. This is good for British business. Next, please. So just a few things that are happening, and as Natalia indicated, diversification of economies is very important, simply because there's a big effort to diversify, but also young people who are entrepreneurial and people that are looking for new opportunities are going to be diversifying where there's need. And so there is a big opportunity there. And when new markets start opening up, then there's opportunities for machinery and new things happening. Education is another big one that we've been involved with quite a lot. And we're seeing that higher education and especially technical skilling up is really important. And that's one where we've done a lot of linking. Next, please. So what do the young Africans have that the Chinese and other East Asians didn't have in the year 1980 when things started kicking off for East Asia? First of all, most young people in Africa can speak English, and I would say that a good plurality of them can speak it extraordinarily fluently, and a lot of them can speak it better than me. So that's the key thing. The next thing is they've got access to global information at their fingertips. Can you imagine where China would be if they had these two things at the kickoff stage in 1980? So I think that we've got a very good start to where the African culture is going, and this is why I think things have kicked off in Africa. We've seen a change toward the good in Africa, and there is a lot of upheaval, but often with change there is some a dishevelment. There's going to be some movement downward as disruption happens before it can get better. And this is part of what some countries in Africa are going through. Some of them have already gone through this. And so this is going to be really something to watch. But Africa's already shown that the change has been happening. We've got fast growth, we've got democratic stability in most of the countries, and we're starting to see really good economic growth. Next, please. So boiling all this down for British business across Africa, there's a list of some of the success areas that my company's been involved in, and I'm sure Natalia can tell you a lot of testimonials from companies that have had sales across Africa. And I can tell you that it is a very good place to come and do business in a new market. Next. So I'm going to give you about 1 minute on South Africa, but South Africa's got a lot of opportunity in terms of its the size of its infrastructure, the sophistication of its markets, the diversification of its economy. In terms of its industries, the service industry is approximating 70%, which is what Europe is. Agriculture is a relatively small percentage, but a big earner. And tourism is actually the biggest export earner for foreign income. There's a list of statistics because with PowerPoints, you have to have a requisite page of statistics. So next, please. And what is a presentation without a pie chart? There's my requisite pie chart. I think that, you know, if you're looking at what's going on in South Africa, the long term is going to be good, and the middle term is looking good. But the present president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, has a lot of issues in terms of diminishing the faction that was supporting the previous Zuma administration. And this is going to have effects on relative stability for the country for the coming while. It's in the long term, if we're looking at Cyril Ramaphosa being successful in his political goals of gluing the ANC back together, then I think that things will be looking really, really good for South Africa, because he really supports a transparent marketplace. He supports non-corruption in business. And if you've been reading the papers and you know the recent history of South Africa, we've come through a period where we've had some real struggles with that. And his ascendancy is a result of the poor outcomes. So I'd really like to say that sitting here in South Africa and having my fingers on the dial a little bit more closely than some of you might have in the UK, the general directions are generally positive, but it means that you're going to see some headlines that might look a little bit disruptive. But I think that overall, we've got a good economy down here, and we do have our long-term strategies that need to be worked out a little further, particularly in terms of youth development and education. That is the one pet peeve that I've really got about South Africa and its institutional growth. They really have to focus on tying into getting the youth tied in. So I think that that's really going to end my presentation, but I'm really grateful for the time. So William, back over to you.
Great, thank you, Richard. Lots of information there for sure, and yeah, some really interesting stuff there too. I'm not going to babble on too long, so I'm going to hand over to Ian now to talk about Egypt. Over to you, Ian.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for listening. I chair the bilateral organisations, the Egyptian British Chamber of Commerce and the Egyptian British Business Council, as well as the Middle East Association. And I've been involved with Egypt now for around 20 years. And when I first had to get involved with Egypt, I knew very little about it. And what I've learned is to be puzzled as to why more businesses are not looking at Egypt, despite a revolution in 2011, a revolution in 2013. And most recently, the major event was the flotation of the Egyptian pound, which meant it devalued by around about 50% in 2016. But Egypt today is now rather different, and it's very stable. There's only about half a dozen slides I'm going to go through. And if you focus in particular on the first two slides and take something away from them, then I think I'll have done my job for today. Egypt sees itself, and we see it from the UK, as being sort of a gateway into Africa, and it's a gateway to and from Africa. The geographic location is up there, you know, sort of closer to Europe and everything, which is jolly good. But the key is in the free trade agreements that exist. And I think with Brexit coming along, it's worth all the British companies noting that Egypt already has a free trade agreement with Europe. It's part of COMESA, as Richard said, it's part of the African Continental free trade agreement. It's also importantly part of the Greater Arab Free Trade Agreement through into the GCC and part of the Agadir Agreement, which includes most of North Africa. So Egypt, from that point of view, can offer a wide spread. There's good diversity in what's actually going on in the country. It used to have a reputation for not building things to high quality, but that has changed over time. And the government has done a number of major developments, say along the Suez Canal, where a second channel was built, and that's actually opened up some areas for manufacturing opportunity. Like most of the African continent, there's a large consumer market there. It's estimated as around 100 million, with probably nearly 10 million actually in other countries remitting monies overseas. And I think it's worth noting the point again that Richard was making about the young workforce. There's about 300,000 graduates coming out in Egypt, which can potentially create a social problem, but it does create a very good potential workforce for people. If we touch on one of the headlines, which is a high return on investment, I've been involved with Vodafone in Egypt for nearly 20 years there, and Vodafone was listed in 2003. So a lot of the data that's available is actually in the public domain. And if you had invested in 1998, when that company started up, since 2003, the annual dividends coming out were equal to the original investment for several years, right through until just about through to the first revolution. And it doesn't mean that business is doing badly since then, it's continued, but all the data is private. And part of that is because of good liquidity in the local banks and being able to gear the company up. So if we go on to the next slide, right, if we look at the rate of GDP growth, if in particular sitting as a British company, looking at places where development's taking place, the red lines of the GDP growth in Egypt have outstripped Europe, even when in 2011 and 2013, there was a revolution taking place. We can see that going forward and continuing quite a long way. So we see great potential in this. If we go to the next slide, there's a breakdown there of the products. I'm not going to focus on this page at all, because if you're genuinely interested, you'll get a lot more meaningful information from where we picked this up from, which is the HMRC trading pages, so you can get them there. If we go on to looking forward, the next slide, the Egyptian government activity at the minute is focused, I mentioned the Suez Canal, but in terms of infrastructure, there's a lot of work needed in things like water treatment, transport, it's both road and rail, and the export-oriented manufacturing is being helped through things like the Suez Canal zone that I touched on earlier. Education and healthcare is being pushed by the government, but I'm going to come back to those when I talk about opportunities in the private sector. Next slide, please. Thanks, Will. Okay, the major government projects, I mean, these have actually been both flagship projects for the country to have some pride in what the current administration are actually doing. And the whole concept of the mega projects is it's actually been a controlled area where something like building a new capital, it's been tried in other places. And I have been impressed and surprised with the speed that has moved forward. And a lot of that is being built, and all the government departments are going to be moving to the new capital in order to drag the residential activity with them. I touched on the transport area. In the south, there's a lot of desert, but there are some big mining projects. And up on the north, again, something like the grain hub has got easy access through to Europe. So the government has put a lot of its efforts and focus into those areas. I think if we were going to be critical, We're saying the challenge with this is concentrating this economic activity in a few small areas and not spreading it over the rest of the country. But if I come on to the private sector opportunities, next slide, please. Thank you. When I talk about, we talk about healthcare and education as being important. The government is launching now, and the first trials are starting in Port Said to introduce a universal health insurance. Unfortunately, from a UK point of view, they look to the NHS, which some people in the UK may criticise, but actually it's amongst the best in the world in terms of things, actually in terms of value for money, in terms of providing healthcare. So some UK companies have got some, basically a good advantage in being able to do things there. But the whole area of health facilities includes the need of building facilities. And this applies equally in the need for education. Like other African countries with the growing population, there's a desperate need for school places, so there's a desperate need for schools. As the health facilities improve, there's a desperate need for improved health facilities. Going into the other areas, and I'm trying to crack on at a pace, and we'll take questions if need be for more. This is a country which used to be the leader in entertainment products. It was the Hollywood for the whole of the Arab world at one point, and now it is beginning to lead the way in some of the technology areas, and in particular the fintech and microfinance activities in Egypt are moving forward quickly. And again, like much of Africa, because of the better education of the younger people coming through, almost everyone is an entrepreneur. So in terms of a country where you can go and start to do business with people, Egypt is looking attractive. That brings me on to how we can help on that, which is the next slide on the chamber. I mean, we do all of the obvious things that a Chamber of Commerce will do. Whether it's actually, advisory, we work very closely with DIT in Cairo on this. We can confirm and certify documents for people, and we can also help people to meet and validate potential partners. And that's something that we have some more freedom in doing than necessarily DIT. Natalia may disagree, but I think DIT has its hands tied a little bit more than we sometimes have. If you want to know more about what the Chamber does, it is theebcc.com, fairly easy to find. So to summarize, next slide. Okay, from the outside, I've not touched before on the political situation. I mean, clearly, having gone through 2 revolutions, what's the position now? This is one where there is a stable government. And I mean, what we have is, very strong leadership, and there can be questions sometimes about, is the freedom of the press what it should be? Well, from a business point of view, we can look at the country with confidence because it is a stable. It's very clear what's going on, very clear where businesses can operate. That brings us on to the economic situation. I touched on the GDP growth, and we see that continuing. The population growth is going to put a pressure on government finances, and needing to find enough jobs for all of these young people coming through is the challenge. But the technology advances in Egypt are very strong. So what we've seen is in the very recent past, in terms of the social activity, the government has made moves to increase the minimum wage in the country, so that one of the mistakes that happened the last time the economy moved forward in Egypt was it didn't trickle down to the bottom fast enough. So the government has made moves this time so that the benefits of an improving economy are starting to be felt much further down. So again, we would anticipate social stability from that point of view. The part of the population that's probably found it hardest in the most recent years is the growing middle class, where things like education, which are paid for in hard currency, got hit when there was a big devaluation. But through a devaluation in 2003, been through the devaluation in 2016, and we're anticipating a long period of economic growth from here on in. So that really brings me to the end. Next slide. Thank you for listening, and I'll hand back to Will.
Thank you, Ian. A fascinating market and a really great presentation there as well. Now, last but not least, to talk about West Africa, hopefully we have Manny. Manny, you there?
Hello, Will. Thank you. I am here. Hope you can hear me.
We can hear you.
Excellent. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, William, and say thank you to Ian on Talk on Egypt, and Richard, obviously, done a very good job on Africa as a whole and South Africa. So can I have a second slide, please? And I'll introduce what OREIT does. OREIT Group, we help to assist companies going into the West African market. It started with construction sector, and it's grown from construction into energy, power, and other sectors in that period. Now, I know Richard again gave a very good introduction into Africa, so I was going to look primarily at Nigeria and Ghana in West Africa. Could I have the next slide, please? Now, West Africa, there are 16 countries that make up the West African region within the sub-Saharan Africa. And of those 16 countries, Nigeria by and far has the largest population and GDP, followed by Ghana. And those markets keep changing. They've changed from when I've been looking at them, which has been early 2000 to where we are now. And they've changed for the better each time. And other countries that are becoming prominent in West Africa are countries Liberia, Sierra Leone, where they've had some problems, but are now coming back very strongly into market areas, Senegal, and Burkina Faso is beginning to show again. This is to looking at power and energy. So as a whole, this sector is growing, and it was interesting to see the slide that Richard showed, which showed the growth in population and GDP across the years till end of the century, and it showed how West Africa, even within Africa, was going to grow. So it's an area that has a lot of potential, and quite a few countries there are English speaking. UK would do well in all of those countries. I know, because I've been there a few times, Cameroon are actually looking, they're not part of the West African bloc, but they're looking really to tie into that as well. I was part of a trade mission from the UK to Cameroon a few years ago, met with the government, and there was a lot of keenness in being seen almost as part of that bloc. Within West Africa, looking at GDPs, for example, Nigeria, looking at the whole of Africa, probably has the highest or second and third between South Africa and Nigeria, trading that on GDP, and Ghana comes in about seventh. So it's a sector that is of importance and quite with easy access for UK businesses. Next slide, please. Now, opportunities in West Africa as of now. I'm paying more attention as I'm going through this more on Ghana and Nigeria. So, and something that was mentioned in the introduction by Natalia on power and renewables. Those are becoming really big for people trying to import into those markets. So anybody in those sectors would do very well. Things to do with power generation and renewables just for households and for individual people. So that's something that we found in the last couple of years that's been a big interest. Now, also big coming on as well is health and healthcare, and particularly analysis of various conditions that people tend to have, because the population in these sectors now are more youth, and they're more aware and of the importance of health. So there's a lot of demand. In fact, I would probably suggest to companies who are in that sector to look at not only importing to that sector, but also at actually helping to assist with the uptake of the technology in the sector. Education is quite important and has to do with training. And I would tie that also with technology. I mean, and I would, in that space, I would include, mobile technology. So it's fast growing. There's a lot of interest. So it's a key area that people need to look at in this sector. Again, the fastest growing economies because it's been driven by youth, and the youth have a global awareness at the moment because of social media and the like. They see what's going on elsewhere, and they want those good things for themselves. So it's now how to join those 2 points. It's how from the suppliers, from the manufacturers, say from the UK, how to get into those markets and get to the very point of need of those of the youth wherever they are. And again, it varies as well, but opportunity is there and it's for the taking. There's appetite for growth and appetite for change. Now, what I meant by that is the youth, as Richard mentioned, and I think Ian as well, they tend to hustle. Maybe it's a nature thing, and by that, their entrepreneurship, they are quite strong in that, and they would go looking for what they want, and they've now become a real, very strong power base. Nigeria as a country just had some election, and in some specific states and in some specific regions, the youth actually changed the outcome of the election, where there were normal, traditional political stakes in certain areas. But because the youth said it did not work for them last time, they changed it. And that's the power that they bring. And that's what the governments in these countries now are also now realizing, that they have to be mindful of what the youth wants. Again, I'm buttressing back again to something that Richard mentioned about that age group from 25 to 35. So they just have young families, they want the best for them, they have awareness of what's going on elsewhere, and they want it for themselves. So next point is easier market entries. Again, it's been covered because we now have the Africa Continental free trade, and it's even countries that haven't signed are moving towards it because they're realizing that if they don't, they will get left behind. So quite a lot of governments, whether they've signed or not, are actually moving in that direction because they all want the growth and they want the success for their country. So it's making access to those markets easier than it was before. Now, I've got less rigid structures. That it's true, it's an opportunity and also a challenge because in the West, in the UK, for example, we have very rigid structures on how we do things. In Africa, that rigidity is still growing. So you need to go into those markets knowing that things are still fluid. It's a positive and also be a negative if you don't take cognizance of them. And when you go into this market, keep it very simple. That's what they're looking for. They know what's happened elsewhere. Unfortunately, they've not seen the process of how it happened. They've seen the change, they like it, and they want it. So the simpler your entry point is, the better. Next slide, please. Now, potential challenges, diversity was covered, I think, earlier on. The various countries have, even within each country, they have the religious diversity, you have ethnic diversity, and you need to be aware when you're going to a specific market, what the do's and don'ts, if I could put it that way, of those markets are. Because it's in, almost as an example, even how you give your business card, or particularly we in UK, we like punctuality of meetings. In some of those markets, it's not so important. So you have to be aware of that as well. So it's key to, understand the market you're going into, the country, even the part of the country that you're going into, to understand who your end users or your buyers or your stakeholders are going to be. Again, this is where, less rigid structure. It could be a positive and it could be a negative. So I say to people, clients that I go into these markets with, that once you land in the local airport, you take off your UK hat and then you put on your African hat, and you got to develop it to be able to understand, to be able to actually work freely and happily in those markets. Close knowledge of the market is very important. Market research. Nigeria and Ghana have the presence of the TSU to make real use of them, even before you leave the UK to go there. The right partner, absolutely fundamental, because sometimes you could be speaking the same thing, but not of the same mind. So that's something that you need to really understand, and you will need support no doubt about that. You can't go just from the UK market into those markets thinking the same way we shake hands here will be the same thing shaking hands in Nigeria would mean to the person to whom's hand you're shaking. So an understanding of that is quite key to be successful in those markets. Feet on the ground. Again, Ghana, Nigeria, we have TSU presence to be very helpful, but you need to be there yourself as well to make a success of the trade. And lastly, no assumptions. Assume nothing. Quite a lot of people we've worked with, because something has worked in the UK, they assume it will work in this market, even though there are huge potentials and successes for the items that's been put forward. But you make no assumptions. You actually create the end results that you want to have. And I think on that note, I would end. I know time is fast gone. I would end on that, but I can take questions later on. Back to you, William.
Thank you, Manny. An excellent presentation there. Again, another fascinating part of Africa. Now, the nature, of course, of having 4 presentations today means we're pretty short in terms of time for Q&A. So I'm just going to do a quick fire question, which I'm going to put through to each of you, starting with Manny, I think. And the question I'm going to ask is, what advice would you give to businesses on the line in terms of finding a distributor in the markets? So in your case, Nigeria and Ghana markets, Manny.
Okay. What we've done before is usually we go to the front of the TSU and say, look, we want to enter, let's say, food and drink market. Because we have local companies who also approach TSU locally and sometimes who are vetted by them. And we say, look, we want to meet those that have already been vetted and start a discussion. So what is key is getting that shift done either through the TSU or companies like ourselves or similar other companies who come and have vetted some companies and bring them to the table for you to meet. And I would suggest do meet each of them. You could meet them from the UK and then still go down and meet them as well. So it's all by talking. And some things instinctively you would know would work. Some things you would not.
Excellent, thank you. And Ian, in terms of the Egypt market, what tip would you give in terms of finding partners or distributors?
I think you need to be very clear on what it is you're wanting to achieve. I think some of the messages coming through from South Africa about British companies being respected because they're known to be straight, and the British attitude is being absolutely straight and anti-corruption is very helpful. And there has been a change in terms of sort of some old style companies that are fading out of the way, and some people I would have thought of as charlatans that were around the market at one point, where people have gone in and found bad partners. So I think it's a case of having being very clear on what you're looking for, recognizing the strengths of your own business, and identifying what the local partner is going to bring, whether it's distribution or knowledge of the market or whatever, and then doing full referencing and due diligence on who you might work with. The IT in Cairo do a good job in terms of finding introductions, and through the chamber as well, we're very happy to be able to do work on that in finding, even informally, through our partner networks.
Thank you. And Richard, in terms of South Africa and maybe a little bit East Africa as well, what tips would you give in terms of finding partners and distributors?
I think the first thing is know exactly what your product differentiation is, and understand too that Africa is no longer a dumping ground for things. People look for innovation, they look for high-tech solutions, they look for global best, and Africa is not, it's kind of leapfrogging over the African solutions to African problems to African solutions to global problems. And this is how the young people are starting to think. How can they get wealthy by working with someone from Britain? And consider also the fact that people do want to be linked into the British economy. Britain is perceived even now as the place to be. Go to London, that's a place to be. And having a friend there is a key element to doing business. And it might sound a little strange to you, but the British connection is extraordinarily important, and people will want to look at that, to use it. I would also just echo the comments that make no assumptions. Manny's absolutely correct. Do your due diligence, as Ian says. Follow up and know who exactly you're dealing with, because there are people out there who do not have your good in mind, and that's good advice wherever you go. We have done this work for 20 years, and a big part of it is character filtering. And we've never had a problem with having anybody having something stolen from them, because we look at, first of all, the character of the people in the company that we're linking up with. And I would agree completely with the other two speakers there.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I just got a message from Natalia saying she's having to shoot off, which probably brings me to time to wrap up. So yeah, once again, thank you to each of our speakers. That's a really information-packed webinar today. And yeah, thank you each of you for speaking today. So just in terms of our outro slides, in terms of what the Institute of Export and International Trade are doing at the moment, some of you will know that the Incoterms rules that play a central role in international shipping, among other things, are changing next year. We will be running a series of training courses in the autumn to help you stay up to date with these changes, so we do definitely recommend you have a look at those. The Institute also continues to do a lot of work in professionalising skills and knowledge around international trade, and our professional pathway is an ideal way for you to learn how exporting is done, allowing you to find your ideal entry point into our training and qualifications and setting your path towards gaining the skills you need. We are also running several Brexit-related training courses, including our post-Brexit planning workshops in the lead up to October 31st, so do ensure you're looking at those to ensure you're properly prepared, and also you can look for more details about our recently launched export control profession at exportcontrolprofession.co.uk. In terms of open to export, we're taking a break from market webinars to explain why we think it's important that businesses and individuals are gaining the professional skills of international trade. We're going to do a webinar with a few of our recent graduates on July 25th, and you can find sign-up details to that at opentoexport.com/webinars. But as always, please do take our exit survey to let us know what you thought of today's webinar and to give us any suggestions for improvements or future topics. But for now, thank you very much, everyone. Goodbye.